The Seven Kingdoms have never had a ruling queen. The first Viserys intended his daughter, Rhaenyra, to follow him. Do you deny it? But as the king lay dying, the Lord Commander of his Kingsguard decided that it should be otherwise. The Kingmaker brought grave harm, and gravely did he pay for it. Aerys Oakhart and Arianne Martell, A Feast for Crows, Chapter 13, The Soiled Knight. Who is to blame for the Dance of the Dragons? The Targaryen civil war that almost brought down the dynasty. I'm not just talking about the death of Lucerys Velaryon, or the formation of the Blacks and the Greens. While all of those events are of course important, what I want to delve into is how far back can you trace the very root causes? Is it Viserys' marriage to Alicent? Jaehaerys passing over Rhaenys? Maybe you could even trace it all the way back to Aegon the Conqueror himself. There is no one clear-cut answer to who is to blame for the Dance of the Dragons, and I don't think we can ever blame one individual solely. But what I aim to do with this video is narrow it down, and specifically, if I can, come up with a few clear choices. At its core, the Dance of the Dragons comes from the rival claims to the throne of Rhaenyra Targaryen, King Viserys Targaryen's oldest living child and chosen heir, and her half-brother, Aegon II, Viserys' eldest son via his second wife, Alicent Hightower. Aegon, whose claim comes from the precedent of the Great Council of 101 AC and the historical context favouring male proximity preference primogeniture. This might be a controversial view in the Song of Ice and Fire and House of the Dragon fandom, but I do believe both Rhaenyra and Aegon have valid claims to the throne for very different reasons, and it's that fact that makes the Dance of the Dragons such a compelling story, because both the Blacks and the Greens are equally as correct and equally as wrong as each other. After Viserys remarried after the death of Aemma Arryn, it's kind of all but inevitable a succession conflict would happen, all the while Viserys remained steadfast in breaking convention and naming Rhaenyra his heir. As we will soon learn, while Viserys does play his part in laying the groundwork, he is just one piece of the bigger picture. In this video, however, it is not about who's right and who's wrong, but more or less why choices made by several men and women over 130 years led to the House of the Dragon tearing itself apart. What did Viserys ever have that she did not? A little sausage? Is that all it takes to be king? The court fool mushroom on the choice of succession, fire and blood, the dying of the dragons, the Blacks and the Greens. The lead up to the Dance of the Dragons is really a result of a cascading domino effect from a single event in 92 AC. How one misaimed crossbow bolt changed the fate of House Targaryen and Westeros forever. 92 AC was late into the reign of the legendary King Jaehaerys I Targaryen. Jaehaerys the Conciliator, a man who had done so much to improve Westeros for not just its lords, but its small folk. Rebuilding cities, building roads, bolstering the economy, and reworking the ancient laws of Westeros for a more modern realm. There's a good reason Jaehaerys is held up as the best king of Westeros, only next to Aegon the Conqueror himself. But a hugely overlooked part of the legacy of Jaehaerys is while for 90% of his reign he ruled well and effectively, due to a series of unfortunate events, the last 10 years from 92 AC to 102 AC would define what House Targaryen would become over the next 25 years, and lay the groundwork for the Dance of the Dragons. During this 10 years, there are some things that would happen that were way beyond Jaehaerys' control. But he also did make several key choices that were very much of his own volition. When it comes to Jaehaerys' role in the Dance of the Dragons, most people would say there are two key things he did that started the chain reaction, allowing for the circumstances needed for it. But I would in fact argue there is a third that's even more of a damning indictment for Jaehaerys' role in the conflict than any other, something that's been greatly overlooked. In 92 AC, Jaehaerys' son and heir, Prince Aemon Targaryen, was killed by a rogue crossbow bolt while on Tarth, a bolt that was meant for the man next to him, and not Aemon himself. Aemon had been the Prince of Dragonstone his whole life, and his sudden death at the age of only 37 was a huge shock to House Targaryen and left a huge hole in the family. Aemon had left behind him a wife, Jocelyn Baratheon, and a teenage daughter, Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, who would have been on Tarth with her father if she had not just discovered that she was pregnant with her and her husband, Corlys Velaryon's first child. It was always known that Aemon would have taken the throne after his father, but there was much more uncertainty about who Jaehaerys' new heir would be. On one hand, you had calls by the likes of Corlys Velaryon, Jaehaerys' wife Alysanne, as well as Rhaenys herself, that she, being Aemon's only child, is her father's heir. To complicate the matter, Rhaenys was pregnant with a babe who may or may not be a boy. On the other hand, you had King Jaehaerys' second son, Prince Baelon, who not only went to Tarth to avenge his brother, but was well loved by the small folk, and importantly, already had 2 sons of his own, Viserys and Daemon, securing the line of succession. Baelon was also much older and much more of an experienced, well-accomplished knight, being 35 years of age, versus Rhaenys, whom was only 18. There were pros and cons on both sides. While there was no firm law of inheritance for the most part, House Targaryen until this point tended to opt for male proximity preference primogeniture, much like the rest of the great houses in Westeros, which was something Baelon had in his favour. Thus, in the end, Jaehaerys named Baelon his heir, which was the overwhelmingly more popular pick, and the one most expected. However, the passing over of Rhaenys created a rift between the crown and House Velaryon, as well as between Jaehaerys and his beloved Alysanne. In theory, this choice of Baelon over Rhaenys should have made Jaehaerys' intent when it came to succession clear. But when Baelon died suddenly in 101 AC, rather than once again follow male proximity preference primogeniture, Jaehaerys would call a great council to decide the matter. I do find it a little bit odd, given Jaehaerys clearly had shown his preferred method of succession in 92 AC. So why now, a decade later, was he calling a great council to decide the matter? Some fans put forward that after the death of Alysanne, Jaehaerys may have revisited his late wife's feelings on the matter, and thus saw the calling of a great council as a way to allow his potential heirs to advocate for themselves. A more cynical idea suggests that Jaehaerys, or at least his son, Maester Aegon Targaryen, whom it was suggested the Great Council, knew the reaction from House Velaryon, whom had grown even more powerful and rich in the last decade, should Rhaenys and her children be passed over, again would be damaging, especially now that Rhaenys had given birth to a son in Laenor Velaryon, a male descendant of Aemon Targaryen. Whatever the true motivations for the Great Council were, it was called, and in reality the outcome was never really in that much doubt. Most of Westeros used male preference primogeniture, and most lords would vote in favour of the candidate who represented that. A lot happened at the Great Council, but in the end it came down to a vote between Viserys Targaryen, the eldest son of Prince Baelon, and the king's grandson, and Laenor Velaryon, the young son of Rhaenys Targaryen, the great-grandson of the king. Viserys overwhelmingly won the vote, and with that, he was named heir, and the rift between House Velaryon and the crown deepened. What many believe the Great Council established is that the Iron Throne could not pass to a woman, or through a woman to her son, and it's this precedent which would play a huge role in the Dance of the Dragons. Aegon the Dragon and his sisters conquered the Seven Kingdoms, 6 of them at least, but it was Jaehaerys the Conciliator who truly made them one. The writings of Maester Umbert, Fire and Blood, Prince to King, the ascension of Jaehaerys I. Here's the trouble with both of these key things Jaehaerys did. In naming Baelon and Viserys heir, he did set a precedent of how succession should work, guidelines for future generations. The precedent was indeed a huge factor into why the Dance of the Dragons broke out, and was used by the Greens to justify a legal understanding as why Aegon II was Viserys' true heir over Rhaenyra. They could point to 130 years of precedent. The issue is, precedent is not law. Yes, it can be used as justification, but it's not law. Not a law a king is compelled to follow. And this is what leads me to my third and most overlooked point when it comes to Jaehaerys' role in the Dance of the Dragons. Alongside Sets and Bath, King Jaehaerys reworked and adjusted the archaic legal system and legal codes of Westeros. While we are not told exactly what he did, we simply know he did it. At the urging of his wife, Alysanne, he introduced laws to protect the rights of women in terms of inheritance with the Widow's Law, and outlawed the barbaric right to the First Night, which proved to be extremely unpopular with some of his northern lords, but loved by the small folk. Both of these were huge changes to the legal framework of Westeros, and some, like the outlawing of the right to the First Night, viewed it as an attack by the crown on what was seen as an ancient lordly prerogative. So my issue here is, with his track record of reworking the legal system and changing laws for the betterment of his people, no matter how unpopular, why did Jaehaerys not entrench a system of succession into law? It was clear in 92 AC when choosing between Baelon and Rhaenys that this issue was likely going to arise again one day in the future. So why not make the succession part of the law, rather than a vague precedent that may or may not be ignored? Then again, with the Great Council of 101, not only did it result in the expected likely outcome, Viserys was the overwhelming victor. The ruling of the Great Council would have provided a perfect opportunity to set the succession into law once and for all, and probably something most would have agreed to. Now we must recall that Jaehaerys, by 101 AC, was a very old man with declining mental faculties and was grief-stricken. But he did have a decade before this, really his whole reign, to consider putting this volatile issue into law, one of the things he was most known for. I do think Jaehaerys on balance deserved his good reputation as a king, but I do think the inaction with this matter is a black mark on his record, because this inaction allowed for the events to unfold the way they did. If Jaehaerys had set the succession into law when he had the chance, there would never have been a debate between Aegon or Rhaenyra. Viserys' heir would have been determined for him. Or was it? Because there is yet another wrinkle with this issue of succession and the power of law. He had ruled for 6 and 20 years, reigning over the most prosperous era in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, preceding within it the disastrous decline of his house and the death of the last dragon. The writings of Maester Yandel, the world of Ice and Fire, the Targaryen kings, Viserys I. King Viserys I Targaryen is another key contender for much of the blame of the Dance of the Dragons. We could spend a whole video talking about the things Viserys could have done to stop the Civil War from happening. I personally feel that Viserys' role is much more egregious than Jaehaerys' for a simple reason. By around 120 AC, it was very apparent there was going to be some kind of succession dispute upon Viserys' death. Rhaenyra had remained his heir despite the birth of Aegon, and two very clear factions, the Blacks and the Greens, had formed. Rather than try and find a way to fix the situation before it was too late, Viserys rather stuck his head in the sand and pretended none of it was happening. At Aemma Arryn's death, Viserys was left in a tricky situation in terms of naming an heir, with only two real options, Rhaenyra or Daemon. And due to Daemon's nature and the breakdown of the personal relationship between Viserys and his brother, it really only left Rhaenyra as the only choice. Even then, what Viserys was doing by naming his daughter heir was still very much against the norm and the precedent set by other historical examples. But, on the whole, given she was Viserys' then only child, most in the realm were happy to bend the knee. But here again, Viserys then makes the same mistake his grandfather made. He now had an opportunity to use his power as king to change the law regarding succession, allowing equal inheritance. He could use Daemon at this time, being the rogue prince, to justify this move. But he didn't. Which is why what he does next is really a huge issue. When he remarried, would have realistically have known he would have more children with Alicent Hightower. While politics is a key part of making these matches, furthering your line is also part of it as well. He would have known there was a 50-50 chance one of these potential children could be a boy, which technically should be his heir over Rhaenyra, with many likely expecting that to be the case as well. If Viserys had officially changed the law before this, then none of it would have been an issue, but the fact the law remained unchanged gave Alicent and the Greens legitimate cause to push Aegon's claim as the firstborn son. My take here is that he knew what would happen by remarrying. So if he wanted Rhaenyra to continue as heir, Viserys should have changed the law, or just not have remarried in the first place. If he doesn't remarry, none of this is going to be an issue. But there's even a bit of a twist with this idea as well. The king's word, the king's decrees, are in effect a kind of law. So part of the argument put forward by the Blacks and Rhaenyra's supporters is Viserys naming her his heir is thus the king's word and therefore is law. That Viserys had years to change his mind, but he never did. But hey, at the end of the day, this is why I love the Dance of the Dragons, or more so the politics in the build-up to it, because it is a roller coaster with so many contradicting viewpoints, with the reality being there is no correct answer other than this. Viserys knew this was going to be a problem, but did nothing. In fact, he actively made decisions that would just make the situation more likely to result in a war. For example, remarrying in the first place. Viserys I Targaryen was not the strongest-willed of kings, it must be said, always amiable and anxious to please. He relied greatly on the counsel of men around him, and did as they bid more often than not. The writings of Archmaester Gyldayn, Fire and Blood, Heirs of the Dragon, A Question of Succession. One of the things most often suggested as a way Viserys could have steered House Targaryen away from the Dance of the Dragons is actually Alicent Hightower's suggestion of marrying Rhaenyra and Aegon. On the surface, this seems like it would merge the claims and everyone is happy, right? Well, yes, no, and kind of. The biggest plus side to this plan is the fact you are merging both claims, but it still comes with a lingering issue. Who would be the ruling monarch and who would be the consort? Given what we know of the character of Aegon and Rhaenyra, neither would have settled to be playing second fiddle, especially given the ambition of people around them, the likes of Otto Hightower and Alicent and Corlys Velaryon. I believe when Alicent makes this suggestion, she does so with the intention of Aegon being the ruling king and Rhaenyra his consort, as a way to still satisfy Viserys in the sense he would not be removing her as his heir. When you look back historically to instances where elder sisters married younger brothers, for example Visenya Targaryen and Aegon the Conqueror, and Rhaena and Aegon the Uncrowned, it's still the younger brother who's the ruling monarch, or in Aegon the Uncrowned's case, would have been the ruling monarch. So this idea of merging the claims through marriage does not actually address the crux of the issue. Even in a world where this marriage did happen, we cannot pretend the age gap is not going to be an issue. When the pact is suggested around the year 109 AC, we're talking about betrothing a 2-year-old to a 12-year-old. By the time Aegon is reasonably old enough to marry and consummate the marriage, Rhaenyra would likely be in her mid-20s. While not wholly unworkable, if they had any trouble conceiving a child, much like Viserys and Aemma Arryn, you're really limiting the window of time in terms of childbearing years. There's a reason these marriages often happen very young. 10 years is also a hell of a long time for Rhaenyra to wait around for Aegon to come of age. I highly suspect, from what we know of her as a character, something similar to her relationship to Harwin Strong could have happened. And there's always the wildcard that's Daemon sulking around in the background, with his own motivations, an eye on the throne. Lastly, if something were to happen to Viserys in those 10 years before the marriage, what then actually happens? Who inherits? You would likely have the powerful men and women at court backing their own claimants. But what the marriage would do is at least create a chance, even if it's difficult and complicated, for a peaceful solution. A chance that surely would have been better than a civil war that would tear the realm apart. But ultimately, I believe that Viserys did not act on the idea of the marriage pact for one simple reason. To him, regardless, Rhaenyra was his named heir. He could see the political motivations from the likes of Alicent and Otto for the marriage, and how that could be a gateway into further legitimizing the logic for positioning Aegon as the true heir. What I do find ironic about Viserys naming Rhaenyra his heir is, in a way, he sort of undermines his own claim to the throne as king, given his own father's claim is based off the idea of a woman, Princess Rhaenys, being passed over in favour of a male claimant. He even makes the logic of choosing Viserys over Laenor at the Great Council of 101 look more questionable, given that if you acknowledge Rhaenyra and thus Rhaenys' right to the throne, you in turn are acknowledging Laenor's claim against your very own. This is, I think, really the unintended consequence of Viserys' actions, and highlight how he very much acted emotionally rather than logically when naming Rhaenyra his heir, not looking at the bigger picture of doing so. But by far, Viserys' biggest mistake of all was his willingness to bury his head in the sand and ignore the obvious ticking time bomb he had created. I think Viserys' role is much more impactful in terms of causing the dance than that of Jaehaerys. While Jaehaerys certainly did make mistakes, he would have been looking at more of an abstract issue, where the problem for Viserys was unfolding right in front of him. The groundwork of Jaehaerys' errors allowed for Viserys to make his own mistakes, but many of Viserys' mistakes were wholly avoidable. Aegon the Conqueror brought fire and blood to Westeros, but afterwards he gave them peace, prosperity and justice. Daenerys Targaryen to her supporters. A Storm of Swords, Chapter 71. Daenerys 6. Both Jaehaerys and Viserys are honestly quite low-hanging fruit when it comes to asserting blame. I think if we are really talking about the root cause of the problem, I believe you can make an argument it goes back to the very beginning, to Aegon the Conqueror himself. When it comes to the law surrounding succession, I think George R. Martin has intentionally kept it vague. But what we gather from looking at the other houses in Westeros pre-conquest, especially after the coming of the Andals, is they tend to have used male preference primogeniture. Even the remaining First Men houses in the north, such as the Starks, also seemed to have used this method. The very few cases we have knowledge of a woman inheriting pre-conquest seems to be when they are the last of their line, an instance where there simply isn't any males to inherit. Take Argella Durrandon for example. She named herself Storm Queen after her father's death during Aegon's conquest, only to quickly be deposed by her own men and handed over to Orys Baratheon. Dorne is really the exception to the rule, where men and women are treated on more equal terms in regards to inheritance, at least when it comes to House Martell and the title of Prince or Princess of Dorne. While there are also some other Dornish houses who may use this system, it very much came from the Rhaenyra influence of House Martell than anything else, with there being some Dornish houses who seem to use male preference primogeniture, with these houses having more Andal and First Men ties. But this is where House Targaryen are different from the rest of Westeros. They are Valyrian, and we don't really know how succession, or really the political structure of the freehold, beyond the very limited lore we have. But it would not surprise me at all if they did have a system all of their own that's uniquely different. We only really have access to the Targaryen family tree from after the Doom of Valyria, and even the information between the Doom and the Conquest is very bare bones. But with the information we do have, for the 100 years after the Doom to the Conquest, male preference primogeniture seems like it was favoured. The issue is when we look at the family tree, we only have one single case where there seems to be an elder sister, and that is in fact Visenya Targaryen. And as we know, it was Aegon, her younger brother, who became Lord of Dragonstone, then later King, not Visenya. So the one case we have pre-conquest of an elder sister being in existence, male preference primogeniture is used. So while clearly nothing was ever set in stone regarding succession within House Targaryen, we can say that historically they seem to use the same method of succession for a minimum of 231 years. We have no idea how it worked pre-Doom. When you look at all this in context, you can kind of see why Jaehaerys may not have really taken Rhaenys' claim seriously, and just how big of a breakaway from what was traditionally done Viserys naming Rhaenyra heir over Aegon truly was. Even if you don't agree with the Greens' position, you can understand the logic they are using to make their claim, and just how the situation got so messy. Viserys creates a situation where there are two claimants to the throne, each with valid claims for their own complicated set of reasons. But this is why I do think Aegon the Conqueror should be highlighted when it comes to blame for the Dance of the Dragons. When he conquered Westeros, he formed a brand new realm, a unified 7 kingdoms of Westeros. He did this so quickly by adopting many of the traditions, customs and laws of these 7 kingdoms into his new unified realm. He spent over 20 years establishing what the laws of his realm were to be. He created the concept of the King's Peace and gave his lords a remit to dispense justice in his name, which would often mean each lord's interpretation of Aegon's laws. So when it came to inheritance and succession, for the most part he let his lords decide for themselves how it was going to work. Aegon never codified anything into law, specifically about how succession to the Iron Throne was going to work, who could inherit, how heirs are decided, and of course the role of gender. When you've just formed this large new kingdom, created the dynasty that you want to last generations, at least it seems rather short-sighted to not lay out or codify, how your dynasty is going to function, how inheritance is going to work. If Aegon had laid it out, Baelon would have always been Jaehaerys' heir after the death of Aemon. Viserys always would have been heir after the death of Baelon. And the moment Aegon was born, he would have supplanted Rhaenyra as heir, whether Viserys wanted it or not, unless he used his kingly prerogative to change the laws, making inheritance equal. But what the hell is law anyway? There are countless times in real-world history where the legal inheritance system and who is designated heir is just blankly ignored in favour of who holds the most power. Even in A Song of Ice and Fire lore, we have cases like Maegor Targaryen, who usurped the throne from his nephew, simply because Westeros was in chaos, and Visenya had the political power to make it happen. So even if there were hard laws about how inheritance would work, who's to say people would even follow it? But at least if there was a codified legal framework, in theory it would allow for things to go much more smoothly than they did, and potentially prevent cases like the Dance of the Dragons from ever happening. What I want to make very clear here is just because I'm saying that men such as Aegon the Conqueror, King Jaehaerys and King Viserys made choices that allowed for the Dance of the Dragons to happen, does not mean the other key players at the time are absolved from their part in it. Let's use Otto Hightower and Alicent Hightower as an example here. I suspect prior to the death of Aemma Arryn, Otto was likely laying the groundwork with Alicent's marriage to Viserys. And the moment Viserys marries Alicent, it's clear what Otto and Alicent's political motivations and goals were. They were always transparent about that. I'm not going to sit here and debate who is right or who is wrong, but what both of them are doing is playing the Game of Thrones in a way the system allows them to. A system that the aforementioned kings could have adjusted to prevent the likes of Otto Hightower from manipulating the vagueness of the system for their own personal gain. Otto and Alicent were well within their rights to push the idea of Aegon as heir, given that everybody had been playing that game for the last 230 years minimum. At the same time, Rhaenyra and the Blacks were just as entitled to play their own version of the game, with this new system Viserys had created by naming a woman his heir. Both are equally as valid, and you can blame people from both sides for exploiting a system. The blame lies with the men who allowed for this game to be played in the first place, with short-sighted planning and refusal to make challenging and difficult choices. Aegon, Jaehaerys and Viserys all could have done some things to legally set in stone the succession system, one way or the other, and Viserys most of all was more than happy to walk around blindfolded into a political minefield of his own creation, with nothing but sheer belief and optimism everything would work out. Sadly for Viserys, House Targaryen and Westeros, he stepped on a mine.